The Great Tables package is a fantastic tool to create beautiful tables in Python. You can think of it as a framework to implement the grammar of tables. And originally this package comes from R, where it has the name GT, which also stands for Grammar of Tables, and now recently this package was ported to Python. So to show you what this package can do, today we're going to create this table with Python. So with that said, let's get started. In my Quarto file, I've already set up a code chunk that loads the Great Tables and the Polars package, and it also loads a CSV file that contains our data. If you load this, then you will see that the data that we have right now more or less comprises everything we have in our final table later on. Here the data comes originally from the Tidy Tuesday challenge, but I've already done a lot of pre-processing and data cleaning to get it into this format so that we can focus on making a nice table instead of having to clean up a whole lot of data. The nice thing about the Great Tables package is that it makes it super easy to create a table very fast. All you have to do is to call the GT function from that package and pass the dataset to it, and if you execute this, then you will immediately get a table. Out of the box, this doesn't look particularly nice, but that's exactly what we're going to work on. But one thing that you will notice is that our final table has images in it, but here our dataset doesn't show any images at all. So we have to first figure out how to get images into our dataset. And that is where this GitHub repository from Tanya Shapiro comes in. She has used the Tidy Tuesday dataset to create a table too, and she was kind enough to save her work into this repository. So with that, we do have a directory that includes all the logos from the companies in the dataset. In case you don't know Tanya, she is a freelancer who's working in the space of data visualization, and if you don't know her work, you definitely have to check out her website, because there she demonstrates very cool data visualizations. So in this repository we do have the files for the logos, and all of the files are named according to the stock symbol of that specific company. For example, if you would go to the first image, you would see that this corresponds to the Apple logo, and AAPL is also the stock symbol of Apple. And if you wanted to get that image, you would have to open it in a separate tab, and then in that tab you can take a look at the URL where the file is located. If you take a close look at this, you will realize that the first part is basically the path to the directory we've just seen, and then this path is followed by the stock symbol, followed by the .png file extension. So we can make use of that to get the images into our dataset. To do so, let us copy this part here as our base URL, and then let us head back to VS Code to get the paths into our data. In VS Code, we can first create a new variable, let's call it base URL, and in there we can just throw in the base URL we've just copied. And then we have to modify our dataset, but first let us take this part and throw it into a separate code chunk so that we can have our data pre-processing and our table in two separate code chunks. So now we can wrap our dataset into parentheses to make it ready for method chaining, and then we can use the with columns method to create a new column that we call logo. And to create that column, we will just concatenate a couple of strings, and we start out with a literal string that has opening image tags. These image tags are something from HTML, and in there we can specify things like the height in pixels and the source of the file that we want to add. So here we're just going to throw in the base URL we've saved earlier, then add the stock symbol to this, and then we'll add the .png file extension followed by the closing of the image tag. And if we execute that, we can see that we have a new column called logo, and in there we have a bunch of image tags. And just to be sure that we really have the right data inside of that column, let us take a look at just that column. This still only shows us the first couple of characters, so we can't see the source. So let's make this into a list, and in there we see, if we scroll to the right, that indeed we use different logos all of the time. So with that, we can be sure that we actually did the right data cleaning here. And with that, we can just take a look at the whole data set again. And now we could realize that this stock symbol column doesn't really appear in the final table, but instead what shows up are a couple of line charts, including some trend lines. And these things are images as well. And so that we don't have to worry about how to create these line charts, I have actually saved all of these line charts into PNG files in my directory. So if you take a look at them, you see that all of these files correspond to the line chart that we want to have for each stock symbol. So basically in our data set, we could take the stock symbol column and do the same trick with the image tag as before, but this time For the source, we do not use a web URL. Instead, we just link to the lines directory where all of our files are stored in. So let's do that now. The logic for that is pretty much the same. So we can copy this part and throw this in here again. And then instead of the base URL, we can just put in lines. We don't need a formatted string here. And then we don't want to save this in a new column. Instead, we want to overwrite this stock symbol column. And if we execute this, then we see that the stock symbol column has image tags in there too. So just like before, we can take a look at the logo column and then export it as a list to see if the paths are correct. And I was about to say, indeed, this is the case, but I picked the wrong column. This is still the old column. So here, if we look at the correct column, we can see that now this looks correct. So with that, we can take a look at our full data set again. And let's save this version into a data set that we call df cleaned. And we can use this data set inside of our GT function now. And now we immediately see that we do have the images inside of our table now. All of the columns are not in the right order yet, but this is something we can worry about later. One thing that is still bothering me in this picture, and well, a couple of things, but one thing I want to focus on next is the fact that all of these labels are way too long. You see, everyone knows Amazon, no one talks about Amazon.com Incorporated or International Business Machines Corporation. Everyone just knows that as IBM. So this is why we should clean this up a little bit, and this is where we can add more instructions to our with columns call. So here we should modify the company column, and we start out by making sure that IBM is actually written as just IBM. And to do so, we'll use the when function, and in there we check if the stock symbol contains IBM. If that is the case, then we'll just say that cell should be IBM, and in all the other cases, we can just leave the value as is. And that way, if we execute this and also re-render our table, we see now that we do have IBM here. And just to make sure that we do see the changes immediately, let's just select the company column in this code chunk here, and that way we see our results immediately. Speaking about results, we can see here that we have a deprecation warning. In a future version, we see here that we should use a literal string instead of just writing this out as IBM. So let's just throw this in there. Otherwise, we'll always get an annoying deprecation warning. So with that, we can execute our code without the deprecation warning. And now to get rid of all the extra annoying things in the company names like comma, inc. dot, or .com, or corporation. To get rid of all of these, we can just find these strings and replace them with empty strings. And all of that works with string replace all. And there we can just look for a regular expression and replace that with an empty string. In this case, the regular expression, this one here, it looks for a comma, it might be there or it might not be there, and followed by inc and a literal dot. And that way we get rid of all of the inks like comma, inc, dot after Netflix became just Netflix. And by the same logic, we can use the same strategy to get rid of words like corporation, platforms, and systems. And then all that's left to do is to get rid of the .com here. So let's throw this in there too. And now we have nice company names for our table. It might even be possible to throw all of these steps into one regular expression, but honestly, it's just easier to think of small steps in between. So now that our data set is cleaned, let us take a look at our table, and we can see here that the company column has nice names in there. But one thing that is still off is the order of the columns. But we can easily fix that by going into our data cleaning code again and just using the select function to select the columns in the order that we want. So first we want to have the logo, then we want to have the company name, followed by the opening prices, then the change columns, and then the stock symbol column that right now has our line chart. And if we execute this now and take a look at our table, then we see that everything is in the order that we want. And with that, I promise you, we have finished the data cleaning part, and now we can focus on the GT part and just throw functions from GT on top of this to make the table look really nice. As you might have guessed, to make a table look nice, what we have to do is to throw in a whole bunch of steps. And the first step that we could take is to combine a couple of columns with an extra title. For example, we could use an extra title for the opening prices and for the changes. It would be neat if above these column labels we have an extra label that says these are the opening prices, and we can make that happen by using the tab spanner function, and in there we just have to specify the label that we want to have. In this case we could even use the markdown function to wrap our label that we want to have opening prices into these asterisks to get bold text for our label, and then we have to specify the columns that we want to target. In this case it is the one that has the opening prices, and if we execute that, then we see that we have a nice label for the opening prices now. And just as I've said, it has a bold label because we have used the markdown function here in combination with markdown notation. And the same thing can be done with the label for the other columns. In this case, we could label this change, and then we have to specify that we want to target the change columns. And that way we get a nice column spanner there too. Cool, so we have learned the fundamental thing about how to style GT tables, and that is to first create a basic GT table and then throw all kinds of function on top of that to modify the table to make it look nice. And one thing I want to point out here is that whenever we want to target specific columns, we always use the column names that are displayed in the original dataset, in the df clean dataset. So if we look at this data, we always can find the column names that we need to use. And this might be different from the ones that we have in the table later on, because these kind of labels like change_apps and change_rel are nice for programming, but definitely not for putting this into a table that you want to use to communicate stuff to someone. So that's why you can change these quite easily with the cults label function. And in there you just have to list how you want to name the columns that are in the dataset. So for example, for the stock symbol column in the dataset, you can use markdown notation again to call this opening prices over time. And similarly, you can do this for company, logo, the opening columns, and the change columns. And with that, you have cleaned up all of the column names for the columns in your table. And don't forget that you can always use empty strings as labels too. And that way you can remove a bit of clutter from your table when a label is not really necessary. For example, for the logos or for the company names, you don't really need a description because everyone knows that these are probably names and the logos are just pictures. So no need to label that. Oh, by the way, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button because this helps me to create more videos, because with every like that this video gets, I feel better and better about myself, and that's the key to productivity. So thank you for hitting the like button, and now let's get back to the video. Okay, what do we want to do next? Let's have a look at the numbers here. Right now the numbers are a mess. I mean, there are way too many decimal numbers in these numbers, and really they don't have anything that show us immediately what they are. For example, the numbers in these three columns, those are currency amounts, so it would be cool if we would have something like a number in dollars in there. And similarly, it would be nice if that column would actually show the relative changes in percent and not some decimal. So it would be nice to get a percent sign in there. And for these and all kinds of other scenarios where you want to format the numbers, the Great Tables package has a nice set of functions that all start with fmt_ and then are followed by the use case that you need to do exactly what you need. For example, for the currencies, you could use fmt_currency and then specify the columns that you want to target. And once you do that, the things and those columns will be formatted as currency. And similarly, for the percent thingy, you can do the exact same thing. For that, we have fmt_percent. And if you look into the documentation of this, you will find the list of all of the nice formatting function that you can use on a table. And the cool thing about this is that all of these functions are also usable not only on a table, but also on single numbers or lists of them. So you see that Great Tables has a whole bunch of functions to make our life as easy as possible. And speaking about making our life as easy as possible, GT also comes with great default settings, like making sure that all columns that have text in them, like the company names, that they are left aligned, because that makes it really easy to read the things that are text, and all the numbers like currency or percent, these are right aligned, because this helps with comparing numbers quite easily. But if you ever wanted to change the alignment of a column, you could just use cols align and then specify the columns that you want to align differently. and tell that function how you want to align things. Here I'm just doing that mostly for demonstration's sake, but also to get the column label for the last column center aligned. This would be the appropriate thing in this scenario. So if you execute this, you can see how mostly only the column label shifts and all the other things more or less stay the same. Next, let us work on the style of specific cells in our table. And all of that is funneled through the tab style function, where you can specify the style and the locations that you want to style. Here we can start off with a basic change of making the things in the company column bold, and everything else can remain unchanged. For this scenario, we have to fill the style argument with something that makes it bold, and for that, GT has a couple of helper functions like the style.text function. And in there you have a whole bunch of arguments like weight to style the text. And in case you're ever wondering what arguments you have available in that function, I feel like the documentation online is quite nice and shows you all of the things that you might want to do in that function. And as for the locations that you want to style, GT also has a function called logBody that helps you to select locations of cells in the table body. For that function, there are available the arguments columns and rows, and here we just specify that we want to target the columns company, and if we don't specify the rows, then we automatically target all rows. And with that, we get bold text inside of our company column. And while this is nice, the tab style function is actually even more powerful than that. Where it truly shines is with conditional formatting. For example, we could make sure that the things in the change columns, like the absolute change and the relative change, are colored differently depending if a value is positive or negative. So for negative values, we could use a red color. For positive values, we could use a green color. And all of that can be done with tab style as well. So if we add another layer with tab style, we can specify a style. In this case, we could do the red color thing. And then we have to specify the locations. For that, we use the same function as before, and we target the change columns. But where things get really interesting is in how to select the rows that we need to target. And for that, we can use an expression to check whether things in the change absolute column are negative. And with that, if we execute this, we can see that all of the cells that have negative values in them will be colored in red. And similarly, we can add another layer to this and style things with a green color. And there we target things in the body of the table again. We target the same columns, but this time we target the rows that have non-negative values. And that way we have green values in the change column. Nice. As you can see, our table looks already pretty good. All that's missing is a bit of context that we need. And for that, we can add a title, a subtitle, and source notes. And for the title and subtitle, we can use the tab header function and just specify the title. In there, we can use Markdown again, and we can specify the subtitle by throwing the text in there. And with that, we get a table that has a title and subtitle now. And if we wanted to change the font family of the title, we can use a little HTML trick by wrapping the text that we have in our title into span tags with a different style. So let's throw in a span tag with a style that changes the font family to Merriweather. And of course, we'll also have to close the span tag. And if we execute that, then we see that the font changed. And as for the source node, there's another function that does exactly that. And in there, we just throw in the source node with Markdown notation again. And we could specify things like the data, where we got it from, and the fact that I created the table. And if we wanted to, we could also throw in a LinkedIn icon. But of course, if we render this, then we see that, well, this just writes out LinkedIn, which I don't want to have there. So this is why we use the same trick as before. We just wrap the LinkedIn text into span tags, where we set the style to some font family, in this case the Font Awesome 6 Brands font family, which renders the word LinkedIn to an icon. And if we do that, we can see now that we have the LinkedIn icon in our source node. And if we wanted to make things right aligned, we can use the same trick again, but this time with a div tag. So we throw in a div tag where we set the text alignment to right and the font weight to 600, which is bold. We close the div tag, and with that, we see that our source node switches to the right and is bold now. So as you can see, these HTML and CSS tricks can really help you to make the table look like you want it to. But it's worth noting that these kind of tricks only work because we are using markdown notation here, and markdown notation also ensures that HTML and CSS are rendered as such, and we don't just see the plain HTML and CSS code in the output. So that's something to keep in mind if you want to use these tricks. And as for our table, we are almost done. We just have to finish off our table with a couple of table-wide settings. In this case, we use the tab options function. And if you look into the documentation of that function, you can see that, oh boy, it has a whole lot of options that can change a whole lot of stuff. Thankfully, all of these things are labeled sensibly. So things that correspond to changes in the heading all start with heading underscore. Things that correspond to the title in the heading all start with heading underscore title. With the subtitle, it would be heading underscore subtitle, and so on. So all of these things are labeled quite nicely. As for our table, here we first want to make the title a little bit larger and also want to make the subtitle larger. And right now, all of these things are center aligned. And I don't know why this is a default, because alignment works so well out of the box. But I feel like for the title, things are center aligned by default, and I don't think that's a good one. So I always make sure that everything is left aligned there too, just to make sure that it's more legible. And then we can also make the font family a bit different. We can change the font to Source Sans Pro, and we can change the container width to 900 pixel to make everything a little bit narrower. And with that, we have finished our table. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, don't forget to hit the like button and feel free to leave a comment if you have any questions or just want to leave some nice comments. So thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.